Hello and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's talk for the online conference 2021 for the Society for Evidence-Based Policing. It's my great pleasure this afternoon to introduce Will Hodgkinson, who is Head of Crime and Head of Domestic Abuse for Bedfordshire Police. Will be sharing some of the research he's been doing over the last couple of years in Cambridge about the effectiveness of domestic abuse. Before I hand over to Will, I'd just like to say, for those of you who are not familiar with this format, that there's an opportunity to the right of your screen to add comments and to pose questions. This will be turned on during the lecture, and afterwards we will go through the questions and will answer them as fully as he can. We've done a run through, and we estimate that Will's talk will be about half an hour, so we'll have plenty of time for questions. So don't hold back in commenting as we go through. And I will now hand over to Will, and hope you enjoy this afternoon's lecture. Will.
Good afternoon. Let me just hide that. As Rob said, I'm Detective Superintendent William Hodgkinson, and I'm presenting the title "Domestic Abuse: How to Protect Effectively" at this year's Society of Evidence-Based Policing conference. I'm honoured to be presenting today, but it's only possible because of the organisation of the Society of Evidence-Based Policing, the University of Cambridge for the support to allow me to conduct the research, the Metropolitan Police Service for funding the course, and for Bedfordshire Police for affording me the time to be here today. So let me go to this mode here. So, domestic abuse. What does protect effectively mean? And I'm afraid there's no easy answer here. And I want to pose some questions. Does it mean arrest and charge more? Does it mean reducing repeat victimization? Does it mean reducing harm? And how do we want to measure harm? Does it mean we need to understand, do we need to understand what protect effectively means using wider partnership data such as NHS admissions and supporting qualitative feedback? Do we understand it in relation to feelings of safety based on victim feedback? Do we understand it based on morbidity rates? And how do key agencies and partnerships across the United Kingdom define success? How do the violence against women and girls strategies evaluate whether they have succeeded in protecting effectively? Now, please keep this in your mind. In order to answer the question, we need to first understand what protect effectively means. And why does it matter? Why do we need to have a common understanding of success? And I'm going to talk about 4 studies which, for me, really challenge my thinking and our understanding of how we are going about putting practice in place to protect effectively. And the first one is Sherman Harris in the 2015 study, increased death rates of domestic violence victims from arresting versus warning suspects in the Milwaukee domestic violence experiment. Here, victims were 64% more likely to have died of all causes if their partners were arrested and jailed than if warned and allowed to remain at home. Among 791 African American victims, arrest increased mortality by 98%. Is success arrest, or is success reducing morbidity? Among 334 white victims, arrest increased mortality by only 9%. So what are we trying to achieve? Less police contact or reducing morbidity? Do we need tailored policing interventions, as this may suggest? Now, this is politically, morally, and practically very challenging. The second piece of research I want to reference is the Bland and Ariel 2015 research targeting escalation in reported domestic abuse, evidence from 36,000 call-outs in Suffolk between 2009 and 2014. Now here, no escalation of harm severity was seen in the majority of cases. Repeat offending was a good indicator of future offending, but not of increased harm. Indeed, in over half of the highest harm dyads, a unique victim-suspect relationship, there was no prior police contact in relation to domestic abuse. So if we want to protect effectively, how do we do it if harm happens without police knowing about it? The third, and this is a very challenging piece, is a piece of research by John Ross, an MST student at the University of Cambridge this year, who's currently writing up his thesis. And his research title was An Exploratory Study of the Provision of an Independent Domestic Violence Advisor, an IDVA, in Magistrate Court Domestic Abuse Trials for Conviction Rates and for the frequency and severity of repeat victimisation. Now, this study was over 30 months, from June 2016 to December 2018. And John analysed some 559 trials, 514 unique victims. There are 469 in the treatment group, some 84%, and 90 in the comparison. Now, on a Monday and Tuesday, the court had procured an IDVA. An IDVA was available for victims in domestic abuse trials. On a Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, no IDVA was procured. So you had a situation where you had two groups, either an IDVA was available or an IDVA wasn't available. And John looked at it in relation to four measures: trial effectiveness, conviction rates, and repeat victimisation, and post-trial crime harm using the Cambridge Crime Harm Index. And the results were really quite challenging and challenged our understanding as to what is happening here. So when an IDVA was available, cases had an 84% effective rate. But when an IDVA wasn't available, it was 95%, which seems to contradict how we think that may play out. But from a conviction rate point of view, we see that 69% of cases had a conviction where an IDVA wasn't available, but that reduced when an IDVA was available. If we look at it in relation to repeat victimisation, we see that victims suffered almost double the repeat victimisation when an IDVA was available compared to one was not. And when we look at it in relation to harm, we see that victims suffered a mean average of 94 days crime harm when an IDVA was available, compared to just 10 when one was not. And when we look at this from a percentage point of view and a descriptive statistics, we see that victims who had the availability of an IDVA saw a 294% mean average increase of harm. And victims who had no availability of an IDVA saw an 87.5% mean average decrease of harm. So we see it's important to understand what we deem as protect effectively as, because the tactics and the practice we put in place that we think is protecting victims may well not be. And the last study that I want to reference is from Maria Ivandich, Tom Kirschmeyer, and Ben Linton. It's the 2020 study looking at changing patterns of domestic abuse during COVID-19 lockdown. Now, here we saw an examination of domestic abuse during the COVID-19 lockdown in Greater London. Lockdown changed the nature of reporting and the type of relationships where abuse were most commonly reported. Now, abuse by current partners as well as family members increased on average by 8.1% and 17.1% respectively over the lockdown period, but abuse by ex-partners declined by 11.4%. So this is interesting because domestic abuse isn't a single offence. It's a broad range, a broad category of offending with different relationship status: current intimate partner, familial domestic abuse, ex-partner domestic abuse. Can we apply the same set of interventions across a broad range of victims and expect to achieve the same outcomes? Do we require a tailored intervention depending on the offence type and relationship in which it has occurred? Does protect effectively mean the same thing and the same practices for different relationships and different offence types? Now, what's the challenge? And this is very much a Metropolitan Police challenge. This is the volume in the Met between 2020 and 2021, some 155,000 domestic abuse incidences, an increase on the previous year. So we see volume is going up. Repeat victimisation is also increasing. In May 2020, the rolling 12, in the last 12 months, the Met saw 2,250 victims who suffered 4 or more times for domestic abuse. That went up in October to 2,304 and went up furthermore in February to 2,509. In just 9 months, 259 more victims suffered 4 or more times, with a repeat rate that the 4+ victims are increasing by over 10% a year. So if we think about what works, the challenge here, the data suggests that we have some real challenges around domestic abuse. And now if we look at it in relation to domestic deadly harm, a term which uses grievous bodily harm and upwards to murder, we see that the volume is increasing. Back in July 2014 to May 2019, an increase of 100% of the act that leads to death. Death always starts with a GBH, but if we look at the death rate, both murder and manslaughter, we see that that is pretty static. So does protect effectively mean preventing death? Or are we talking about it in relation to the action, the activity which leads to death? And if we look at it in relation to the action, then that's a really challenging position. Does this suggest that policing practice is working really well? Or does it perhaps suggest that our NHS, our fantastic NHS, are doing a fantastic job in keeping victims alive who who previously may have died? So, what works? This is the research undertaken that Rob has briefly mentioned at the beginning. I decided to test the technological advancement in panic alarms to better understand if the new system was better at protecting effectively. And the research title here is comparing two different alarm systems for high-risk domestic abuse victims, a randomised control trial. Research supervisor is Dr. Barak Ariel, and my research question is, does an audio recording alarm system for high-risk domestic abuse victims affect subsequent harm and repeat victimization compared to the national standard panic alarm? So here is a consort diagram, and it's called Operation Protect, and it starts like this. A police officer in one of 5 basic command unit areas: East Area, Central North, Southeast, South Area, and Area South. An officer identifies what they believe to be a high-risk domestic abuse victim, and at this point they apply for a panic alarm, a total of 300 in the trial. Now, no cases are excluded because we automate the process here. So we have to confirm it's a high-risk case, we confirm it's domestic abuse, and we confirm it's in one of those 5 areas. 300 cases were randomized, allocated into what is the RDA3 and the RDA2 intervention. Now, the RDA3 is the audio panic alarm. This is the new alarm system. And the sticker you can see above that is a red warning sticker in A6, which is applied to every front door where the alarm system is in place. And now, at the point where the victim triggers the alarm for needing police help, the previous 5 minutes of audio on a recording loop is locked down. At that point, a live audio feed is established to a control room monitored by National Monitoring the Alarm Company. And they listen into that household up until the confirmation of police arrival. Every alarm activation triggers an immediate police response. When police officers are confirmed as arriving, within 4 minutes, the officers are given 2 audio files to listen to so they can understand what happened and what led for them to be there at that time. Now, this is a static, hardwired in box into each household that has it. On the other side, the RDA2, the standard national alarm, this is simply at the point of a victim triggering the alarm, police get there very quickly. A 999 call is automated. Now, out of the audible alarms, out of the 150, 113 were successfully allocated, some 75.3%. 37 did not receive the allocated intervention, either because the alarm was refused, and we have captured the reasons for refusal, either being not wanting the sticker, feeling like it is not required, or the alarm request was cancelled for reasons such as a suspect or victim leaving the country. On the standard alarm system, 141 alarms were taken up, some 94%. 9 were not allocated, and that was for reasons of alarms being refused by a victim or cancelled by the officer. No cases were lost in the follow-up because it was on the police system, and no cases were excluded for analysis because of the automation already in the system. So what was the method? It's a simple randomised control trial using the randomizer. It was a London-wide RCT over a population of some 3.6 million people. It used a third-party provider of alarms and automated the process to minimize human error. A key part of this research was tight daily tracking. Every day at 8, a three-way conversation with the National Monitoring Director, myself, and the operational lead in London to look back on the last 24 hours and predict and try and overcome any obstacles in the next day, the next week, the next month. The data obtained in order to understand which was a more effective system was calls for service in the 6 months pre-installation and the 6 months post-installation, the number of alarm activations 6 months post-treatment, arrest and charge 6 months post-treatment, crime counts 6 months pre-treatment and post, and the crime harm score using the Cambridge Crime Harm Index 6 months pre and post. Now, the data obtained is pretty significant. And for me, it was really important to get a full range of data to really understand what happened. Now, the crime counts really didn't differ. There is difference in harm, there are difference in calls for service, but it also captured arrests, charges, and number of dependents, the number of children who resided within the address. And then we looked at the difference in crime, the difference in domestic crime specifically, the difference in harm, the difference in domestic harm, and the difference in calls for service and incidents. So, what are the findings? Well, there are three. One, an audio recording panic alarm installed in homes of high-risk domestic abuse victims, total of 150, causes increases in crime detection compared to a silent panic alarm. Now, this alarm achieved a double the arrest rate, 0.2 versus 0.1 arrests per victim, 30 compared to 15. So if we're looking to arrest more, this seems like a good technological advancement. Now, nearly double the charge rate, 0.12 versus 0.07 per victim, 18 versus 10. But if we consider in relation to harm, the audio alarm, whilst it achieved a reduction in harm, a minus 217.19, the silent alarm achieved a greater reduction in harm, 363.29 fewer crime harm days suffered. Number two, the audio recording panic alarm installed in homes of high-risk domestic abuse victims, 150, increases contact with the police, but not crime counts. So here we see from a difference in differences calls for service on the audio alarm, 0.34 calls per victim compared to 0.14 on the silent. Now, when the data has been looked at here, this is because, if you recall, when police officers are confirmed as arriving, the audio ceases. But in order to confirm that, National Monitoring were calling through to the Met Command and Control System Centre to confirm that they had indeed arrived. So this difference was an implementation failure for the experiment. 2.3, the post crimes. Now, this is important. The crimes that were recorded post the alarm being issued were exactly the same, 1.12. So we see the same number of counts, but we see a difference in crime harm and a difference in arrests and charges. Now, an interesting third point was around the length of alarm deployments. Now, 97% of alarms do not activate after 90 days of installation. So when we talk about protect effectively, maybe we're talking about protect effectively in the first 90 days only, and to be really good in those first 90 days. Now, this finding, if alarms were removed at 90 days, would save the Met up to £300,000 a year. So, some additional findings. In a large number of cases, victims appear to have let perpetrators back into the address, rendering the sticker and the warning on the doors relatively useless. In a number of cases, victims informed officers that the alarm had been set off in error, even though the audio supported that not being the case. So cases where the dog had set it off or the children had set it off, when the pre-recording audio clearly captures an assault and a victim triggering the alarm for help. Third point, audio evidence seems particularly useful as a tool for enforcing orders where all that is required evidentially is to prove that an order was in place and an individual was at the location when they were not meant to be, and allows for a victimless prosecution. Audio evidence, when played in interview, did support officers in effectively challenging the accounts of perpetrators who were denying any offence that had occurred, and at the point of playing the audio, made full admissions of the offence. Now, this was particularly effective in breaches of court bail, domestic violence protection order breaches, and breaches of non-molestation order. When looking at levels of confidence or satisfaction, National Monitoring conducted a series of interviews with victims and saw that the audio had a marginal level of reassurance, but reassurance levels for any alarm provision were pretty high. So, what were the areas of challenge or future research that came out of here? Now, the evidential capture from audio alarms did increase crime identification. This resulted in an increased level of harm being uncovered. However, it does not account for all the harm difference. And we need to understand the why. Why did that happen? Why were the counts the same, but the harm suffered was higher in the audible alarms than the silent alarms? Part of the challenge here is the statistical power. 300 cases in the RCT is too few. This RCT continued from May the 27th, which was the 300th case date, until November the 27th, which would be the 6-month post period. And during this time, randomization continued. So the 300 cases that I talk about today have increased by an additional 588 to achieve a total of some 888 cases with improved fidelity of treatment in the RCT. Now, the results of this larger trial are due towards the end of 2021 and being overseen by the Metropolitan Police Service's Strategic Insight Unit, so one to look out for. My professional view here, from what I have seen and heard from listening to every alarm activation, is that effective prevention is most effective where a victim is fully engaged. Now, it also opens up the role of, what is the role of policing? Now, this research would have amounted to intrusive surveillance without the presence of that visible warning sticker. This sort of tactic is typically used in serious and organized criminality. And so the question is, if this is a very high-level tactic, is this the space for policing? Should policing be actively operating in the space of intrusive surveillance to protect domestic abuse victims, or is that seen as an intrusion into the family? So, to answer the question, domestic abuse, how to protect effectively, you need to understand two things. One, we need to have an agreed understanding of what we are trying to achieve and how to measure it. This needs to be broader than police crime data, and in my opinion should include health data, victim feedback, IDVA feedback. This needs consistency and should be supported at a national level. Number two, we need to increase the capacity to undertake research with a common evaluation framework. What works well may not work for some, may work better for others, but the common evaluation framework is required. And we need further increases of collaboration between policing, partners, and academia. However, in my mind, the biggest challenge is still effective implementation. We have some fantastic research which hasn't been implemented effectively. And to get this right is really, really critical. And lastly, I would like to finish with a thank you. Thank you to the Metropolitan Police for funding the MST and allowing this research to be conducted. And thank you to the MO2, which is the Metropolitan Police Service's Intelligence Command, for supporting with research and analysis to understand the crime harm scores and the pre and post data. Thank you to the University of Cambridge and specifically Dr. Barrack Ariel and Vincent Harriman, who have assisted no end with me to support me through this trial. And on a bit of a somber note, this lovely lady you see on the right-hand side, Rachel Brown, a year ago, sadly was killed on her way to work. Now, Rachel was my lead analyst and partner in crime, if you will, for this research, and goes to show for me the fragility of life. So thank you to committed colleagues and partners online who are doing your best to make a positive difference. Please look after each other, and thank you for listening. I'll now take questions or observations.
Will, thank you very much for taking us through your research. It was really fascinating. I've certainly got some questions myself. Someone reminded me that I didn't introduce myself at the start. It's much more important I introduced Will, but I'm Rob Jones. I'm the Assistant Chief Constable for Local Policing in Suffolk, and I previously worked with Will for some time in the Met, and was a student with Will in Cambridge recently too. So great pleasure to hear about the fruits of Will's research. The first question I was going to put to you, Will, was from Penelope Gibbs. Penelope has asked, the College of Policing What Works meta-analysis shows that DA criminal sanctions did not reduce or increase domestic abuse. In which case, she asks, is the police guidance on positive action re-arrest evidence-based?
Straight in with a challenging question, Penelope. Thank you for that. So in my mind, positive action and what happens as a criminal sanction are two different things. In order to access some of the legal framework and immediate safeguarding, arrest is the tool to get that. But I would agree, if we look at the sanctions that are issued at court, it's to understand what works and what works most effectively. So there's I would look at some of the things. You have a look at the DRIVE program, but we also have Change Plus here in Bedfordshire, which is our diversion scheme. And so I think positive action is right, but as a tool to access an outcome, and it is the outcomes that are obtained at court which need to have the evidence base to understand what works and what we're trying to achieve. But in order to get to that position, arrest is, in a large number of cases, the most effective way of moving that forward, would be my view.
Thank you, Will. Next question is from Paul Clements. Hello, Paul. Paul asks, Will, how will your research inform how you structure your DA investigation in beds?
Okay, so I think there are two bits here, Paul. I think how the research informs how we structure as a partnership in Bedfordshire is one aspect of it. And for me, Bedfordshire has 3 local authorities, and I joined on February the 8th. So we're at the early conversations of what are we trying to achieve and how do we define success, or how do we define protect effectively? And it is at that stage you're trying to agree across local authorities, public health, IDVIS services, other charitable sectors, a common understanding of success, and then have a look at how we set up internally in the police and the mechanisms we use, the things we do to try and achieve that and help achieve that. So once you know what success looks like, you can start effectively evaluating things like Clare's Law, or the new domestic abuse protection orders, or whether community protection notices work, or whether the DRIVE program or Change Plus indeed work. And so I won't be setting up Bedfordshire Police from a domestic abuse perspective until, as a partnership, we have understood what we're trying to achieve and have agreement on that. And for me, this is where, opposed to doing this 43 times, it would be far better to have an agreed national position of what protect effectively means, so that we can go about having an effective evaluation framework, so that our policing practice and partnership practice implementation and commissioning are aligned to that.
Thanks very much, Will. If I may, I've got a question as well. It's about the use of technology. I know there's been quite a lot of evidence-based research about body-worn video in policing, and it sounds like this is quite a simple kind of audio-based piece of technology. Did it present any issues for you around kind of data collection and how it's kept and so on? as part of your research, or did you find it relatively simple?
So Rob, the part of this, the pre-mortem, as Dennis O'Connor would call it, took about 12 months of trying to put in place the data processing contracts, understand how that data is obtained, secured, accessed. And so the movement of data was the most complex because we had to get it from a recording box at an address to a venue in the northwest of England, back down into the Met and onto a police officer's tablet in 4 minutes. And so the implementation and the pre-implementation took 12 months here, whilst the trial was 6 months and the analytical work was another 6 months. The big investment was in ironing out all of those reasons, and actually this research started off by getting a group of practitioners to tell me why on earth it wouldn't work. And that was a really fun session, and a whole range of reasons why it won't work, and that was exactly one of them. And those bits of detail took a lot of time to iron out. So it was complex. It was quite easy to overcome. It just took a long time.
Thanks, Will. And there's a number of questions come in, and quite a lot of curiosity about evidence-based approaches generally. So I'll put some of these to you. Mike Hope is asked, how do you think evidence-based research can become more widely used in policing? As in my experience, many officers do not use research over experience, despite the college seeking to raise its profile.
Yeah, I would agree, Mike. I see that quite often still, and I think it's about things about accessibility and training input, and as I put, one of the last challenges around capacity in the system. For me to expect our frontline, our constables, our sergeants, our inspectors to have the time to understand the latest evidence base is a really challenging position. How much time do we afford them with the demands of policing to sit down, reflect, and review? I really like the fact that the Cambridge Journal of Evidence-Based Policing is open access, so everyone can review it. But actually, that isn't always the case for some of the journal articles. So I think part of it is, how do you distill down the evidence base for the particular units that need to absorb it to understand how to inform their policing practice? So I haven't got the solution, because you posed a big question, Mike. But I would like to see something, and I know the College of Policing have started doing it, in terms of distilling down where the research is for different types of policing practice, but perhaps to look at it in relation to frontline response, to neighbourhoods policing, to domestic abuse, to serious and complex crime investigations, and to try and distill it down more into the structures of policing, so it could become a bit more easy and ready to absorb.
Thanks, Will. And a follow-up question from Penelope. So regarding criminal sanctions, if they don't reduce abuse, should police use more effective diversion?
Penelope, my view would be yes. I know typically we don't go straight for the answer. My view would be yes. And so if we look at the evidence base for domestic abuse, we see that CARA was quite an effective tactic or practice for first-time low-level domestic abuse. And we have an expansion with the Crown Prosecution Service to, I think, 6 areas to trial CARA. And so part of the challenge is overcoming some of the politics and engaging with partners far more broadly, so that evidence-based policing, which I think is actually a bit too narrow a term, could probably become evidence-based criminal justice system. And how do we get to a stage where we don't have 5 areas using CARA, which has a pretty good evidence base, to the point where actually we have that as a national standard? And then how do we look at some of these other areas, which, for instance, in Bedfordshire, we have Change Plus, and Change Plus is very similar in structure to the Hampshire design of CARA, but it works on a community resolution outcome. So we have little bits of good practice or promising practice, but we have no national consistency in it. And it does require localism of having available and appropriate partners to deliver those interventions. But I would agree. I think we should be looking at more effective diversion, and this is where the evidence base is really important, so that the politics of it can be managed. And if you say, are we trying to reduce harm and repeat victimization to victims? I think every partner would agree. But it needs the strong evidence base to be very clear that that is the best tactic to achieve it. And if it is very clear, then I think it's a very hard point to argue against.
Thanks, Will. And I'm glad it's you answering these questions, because there's some big ones coming up. Camille asks, can you comment on any work done on the neuroscience of domestic violence? Why, for example, is violence used to resolve family conflict? Do we need to factor this into evidence-based policing?
I mean, Camille, that's a low baller. That's a low baller. Right, let's try and pick that one apart. So my knowledge on the neuroscience of domestic violence is limited to a level that there'll be colleagues online who know far more about this than I do. But I agree in relation to greater understanding of the dynamics in the family, and a point which is colleagues have mentioned repeatedly, that domestic abuse doesn't just impact the victim, but it impacts all in that family setting. And so we've talked about adverse childhood experiences a fair bit, and we have a greater understanding of what that looks like and the negative ramifications of ACEs. But yet we have little research that looks at what policing practice, what the impact is on the child over their life course. So if you see from this research, we've captured the number of dependents, and we have the details of those children who resided in the address, so that in a 20-year follow-up study, we can understand not just the impact on the victim in the next 6 months, but the impact on the children in that familial setting, to understand what the impact of that policing intervention was. So I think we need to understand far more broadly what's going on in that family dynamic, and to expand repeat victimization to the child. And this is where Professor Sherman's research, looking at 23 years after and understanding the impact, was really significant. And so probably suggests that all research should look at having a 30-year follow-up and look more broadly, not just at the victim, but the victim, the perpetrator, and the children present. So I don't think I've answered your question, but hopefully I've given a bit of an insight, opposed to saying I don't know the answer.
No, that was really interesting. A really interesting question. I'm sure there's lots of studies in that, and a really good answer, Will. Thank you. A bit more of a practical question from Alex Murray. Any advice to listeners about doing their own simple experiments? Yes.
Speak to someone who's done one, and there'll be probably across every force, there will be up to sort of half a dozen colleagues who have gone through doing practical evidence-based research, because the biggest challenge will sit around the amount of time it takes, the way you set it up, the pre-mortem, the implementation, the data capture. But don't be scared that this isn't there's no smoke and the sort of sense of this is something that I cannot do. The best research is conducted, in my view, by academics in collaboration with academics. And so some of the simple research can absolutely be done. So don't be scared, absolutely get into it and get that bug, because it generates more effective practice for us and moves us from practitioners to professionals, in my mind, and seek out people who have made mistakes before to understand what those mistakes were, so you can try and avoid them. I remember sitting down with Vincent, who I detail as part of my thanks, to try and data cleanse 36,000 calls for service, and noting his frustrations with the structured text. So some of those challenges, that if you want to effectively evaluate, the way you set it up right at the beginning and get that learning is vital. So don't be scared, seek advice, definitely get into it.
Thank you. And a question from Sally Kearney. Do you have a specific policy on responding to child 16 plus to parent domestic abuse. How is the overlap with children and adult safeguarding managed?
So we both have policy and practice, and what I don't think we've seen yet, Sally, is policies that break down domestic abuse in those specific categories of intimate partner. This is the best policy. This is the evidence base for it. For child on adult domestic abuse, for ex-partner domestic abuse, for instance. So the police in practice would follow and group up everything for domestic abuse and have the same triage, the same partnership interventions, the same understanding of risk. But what I would like to see is a move to not necessarily specific policies, but it may go that way, but evidence-based that focuses far more on those nuances of domestic abuse, which is a very broad category. And as we've seen from the top four pieces of research I briefly mentioned, it is likely that the approach of how you would approach a current partner intimate domestic abuse may not work for child to adult safeguarding measures. So I think there is, to some extent, an overlap of the sharing of information between partners and the way we process. But I think there is less of an overlap potentially with the evidence base around what works to prevent a reoccurrence in that setting. So maybe a specific policy, but certainly a difference of evidence base, I would suggest.
Thanks, Will. And question from Katrine. Could you elaborate a bit more on why you think you observed the differences between the two types of alarm?
Yes. Okay. So the counts, I think, are pretty similar because in my mind, when the research was started, I thought the A6 sticker deterrent would have a pretty big effect. And from looking at some of the research around the washing of hands in hospitals in America using red stickers to inform doctors and practitioners when they walk into a ward of washing their hands, I thought this looks pretty promising. There might be a crossover there. But on the basis that the doors were opened and perpetrators were invited in, I can see why we don't have any real difference in the crime counts. The harm aspect, and there are different views here, Katrin. Having listened to audio, and I share part of the implementation challenge here that I think only 4 instances the officers actually did listen to the audio at the scene. In the remaining instances, they got picked up afterwards. That the officers, without listening to the audio, made a decision that no crime had occurred here. A victim had said, nothing's happened here. The child has set off the alarm in error, thinking it was a toy. But it's on listening to the audio that a crime was confirmed as occurring. And so a non-crime report, which scores 0 on a crime harm index, then turned into a crime allegation, which came with a crime harm score. So I think that's part of it, because we had a clear movement from non-crime to crime. But looking at the difference in crime harm, which is a difference of about 60 as a mean average, I don't think that accounts for that level of crime harm seen. So there could be challenges here that having the sticker and being aware that the sticker is there increase the level of offending that we saw. And part of this is to understand the why a bit better. So I can give a bit of an insight from going through it, but certainly the difference from what we call the non-crime crime to the crimed crimes wasn't that large, that to the extent that it would account for the difference in crime harm. So I think is understanding the impact of not just the visual deterrent and that sticker, but what that perhaps symbolizes in terms of the victim's engagement with police and what that means for that relationship. And that needs understanding. So I'd like to go to a position of more qualitative around offenders and victims to understand the impact. Did the offender see it? Did it enrage them? Did the victim find it more useful? Did they use that as a tool to try and capture evidence? And certainly in some circumstances, we have victims becoming active evidence gatherers and speaking to the alarm to say he's left, he's wearing this outfit, he's got a knife. So the why, I think, is a really challenging position, and that's probably part of the limitations of an RCT, that the RCT, in my mind, needs to be supported with really rich qualitative research so you understand the what and the why far more. So I think I've elaborated a little bit, but an RCT by its methodology doesn't give you the why, and I think that's a real challenge of an RCT. It needs to have that blended approach of really good quantitative methodology with a strong qualitative approach.
Thanks, Will. Next question from Dan Welsh. Police officers have the autonomy to create localised policies for dealing with domestic abuse. Why isn't there an evidence-based national framework or policy for dealing with DA across England and Wales?
And Daniel, there is certainly some guidance from the College of Policing around approved professional practice. But when I look at some of the evidence base, it's clear that the external validity aspects of it do change. So in COVID, the Metropolitan Police reported that ex-partner domestic abuse had reduced by, I think, 17.1%. But in Bedfordshire, that certainly wasn't the case. So I think there is absolutely the need for an evidence-based national framework, but with a real caveat that the external validity of that research, it may be very different. What you see in Suffolk may be very different to what you see in the Met Police. What you see in Bedfordshire may be different to what you see in South Wales. And so I'm not sure that you can have a national policy or national direction on how to set up the police setup or the partnership because of the nuances of localism. And even looking at the risk factors associated to homicide that Sarah Thornton kicked off in Thames Valley, you look at the differences between Dorset and you look at the differences between Leicestershire and Thames Valley, and you start seeing differences in those risk factors to the extent of how important they are to predict future homicide. So I think there should be far more national guidance, but I'd like to see it in terms of the best evidence base, but with a real caveat that you may want to do that from a local point to see whether that would apply locally. And I agree there is the autonomy for local practice, but it needs to be supported far more by local evidence base as well.
Thanks, Will. Next question is from Polly. Was there any consideration to reflect BAME experiences, harmful practices within this study? And did economic abuse play a factor in the findings?
So one thing that the data has captured, Polly, is the victim detail. So we'll be able to, particularly under the 888 case, to look at these subcategories to say, actually, do audio alarms work best for a certain heritage or race or socioeconomic individual or localism? And so there will be the ability to better understand BAME experiences of the trial and domestic abuse based on, certainly, if you look at Lambeth, Brixton, some of the areas in South London which have quite a big BAME population. And the economic abuse, I don't think we're at that level where we are good enough to be in the detail to understand the why under the economic abuse, because we'd have to, I don't even think from a police report perspective, we look at whether the financial aspect meant that the perpetrator had to come back into the address because, for instance, the flat may be under their name and they were paying the rent. So I think that the drivers, the why for the findings, and economic abuse could be one of them, do need to come out. I don't know if this study will do that because it's largely quantitative, but I agree there is a need to understand the drivers of domestic abuse, and particularly some of the economic abuse, and particularly some of the understanding about whether this tactic works best for some opposed to others. And if you remember the Sherman and Harris study at the beginning, what was quite clear there is that if you were African American, arrest opposed to warning really wasn't the tactic to use if you were looking at morbidity.
Thank you very much, Will. Next question is from Chand. You spoke about pracademics. What opportunities exist for researchers to migrate into policing, specifically within Bedfordshire and or the Met?
Okay, so Chand, I'm going to take this that you're a researcher in an academic sense, opposed to a researcher in terms of an intelligence sense, as some forces have researchers working in their intelligence commands. And so for me, to migrate into policing or to work in collaboration with the policing family on research, if I approach the latter of working collaboration, I think the opportunities are significant. The Met have a strategic insight unit who work in collaboration an awful lot, and that is a fantastic setup. Bedfordshire are not in that position yet, but it's something that we will be doing. And so if you're a researcher in an academic setting wanting to engage within policing, and I will say that Bedfordshire will be there, then absolutely, I think the opportunities are significant. It does require a little bit of a laborious set of data sharing, as you would imagine, but we can do it. If you're talking about migrating into policing as a full-time role, I know the Met have moved into that position. There are researchers and analysts working in the Strategic Insight Unit, but it requires that quite significant investment. And this is one of my second challenge on the last second to last slide, that I think that needs to be far greater in order to target our policing practice. So I think the opportunity to move into policing as a full-time piece are far more challenging than to work in partnership at the moment. But I certainly would like over the next coming years, depending on the finances and the challenge there, to see greater investment of full-time roles within forces. Certainly in Bedfordshire, that isn't currently the case, but in the Met, it is a bit more healthy.
Thanks, Will. And Chand, if I may expand on that as well, especially with my Suffolk hat on, lots of researchers move very successfully into careers in policing on the operational side. There are direct entry opportunities for detectives in uniforms and as a volunteer with special constables. And lots of people do choose to double hat and find it very fulfilling and become better in their research as well. And just one other thing is a number of forces have a kind of a lead academic, like Professor Ben Bradford did with the Met for some time, as a way to kind of triage and coordinate different kinds of research and to get the access into the places you need. So I think we all agree it's a really fruitful partnership and lots of opportunities to share practice. Will, I think that's the last of the questions, but there are some excellent comments and feedback, which I know you'll look at later. If anyone does have any final thoughts, do come in and we'll try and get those in, because we've got 5 minutes left of Will's time. Just a few summaries while I monitor to see if there's more that come in from what I've got from your session, Will. Apart from that, on reflection, you're extremely brave to give so much time to the very searching questions that came in about policing and research in general, as well as about the nature of the research that you've done. So thank you for that. The first observation I've got from our session is actually about that value of questions. And I'm not sure, and you probably reflect yourself, Will, about the questions that you hadn't previously considered that came up, where you had to think through on the spot, and the ones that probably came up while you were doing your research and then implementing. So just that value of opening yourself to questions with a community of intelligent and thoughtful people, I thought really good. The second is just the level of interest still in these areas of research, and just how many opportunities there still are to build on research you've done, to test some technology, and to contribute. So we're still at a really early stage, despite all the published and unpublished research that we've got. The third observation I had and Alex and others have kind of pointed it as towards it in their questions, is how simple it is once you take the plunge and commit to something to actually test and experiment for yourself, and how you can do that wearing lots of different hats. You know, you could do it as a superintendent with lead responsibility for a large area. You could do it as a frontline officer. You could do it as a researcher. You could do it as an analyst. So whatever position you're in, it's open to you to test and to build relationships with people to do something where you see an opportunity to make a difference and to contribute to research.
And I think just jumping in there, Rob, I think that police officers will do this to an extent. So police officers will be quite good at reviewing whether the policing operation worked, whether the tactics worked. And if you consider evidence-based policing just to raise up your methodology for testing whether it worked to a better level, that's a good place to be. I think policing already starts having an evidence base, but a relatively low level on the Maryland scale. And it's just about the awareness of how you may want to review policing operations and tactics that are used all the time. So no, I think a very valid point. I think it does happen a lot, and it's probably far easier than colleagues perhaps think to get into that space.
Thanks, Will. And there's some more observations coming up, perhaps for a further occasion. So, for example, Penelope is clearly intrigued by the IDFA in court research that John Ross has done. I think probably we haven't got time to get into that now, but I'm sure John would be really interested in a different forum to get into that. The final observation I just want to say before I close and thank Will is that there were quite a lot of points. You know, we talked about the technical side, but there were quite a lot of points there about how important the kind of full engagement with people, the relationships and the trust in which you implement these kinds of changes is to establish, and all those things so difficult to measure, but so important for people being kept safe and feeling safe and reassured. And Will, it was evident from the outcomes and the way you've gone about this that at the heart of what you were doing, you were very determined to try to help more people to feel safe in those circumstances. So just in closing, I thank you for taking it on through what must have been a big period of change in your life in different reasons, and a really big commitment, and thank you for trying to make that difference to do your job with your team as well as you can. So thank you everyone for calling in today. Thank you, Will, for giving your time, and I hope everyone finds time to continue the lecture series and to join in next week. So thank you very much, everyone, and goodbye.
Thank you, Rob.